Every farming season, somebody puts in 3 months of work on a chain that was never going to drop a token. They bridge in, they swap, they stake, they run the whole checklist, and at the end of it, there's nothing there to claim. Not because the team lied to anyone, but because nobody stopped to check the basics before they started. Wallets take time to warm up. Proxies cost money every single month they're running. Cloud phones eat storage and bandwidth just sitting there idle between sessions. Spending all three of those on a chain that was structurally never going to airdrop anything is, in my experience, the single most avoidable mistake in this whole hobby. I run proxy farms and cloud phone farms for a living. Dozens of devices, hundreds of wallets spread across them, and I treat this the same way I treat any other operation with a budget and a return I'm trying to protect. That means I don't farm a chain just because it exists and has a testnet running. I check the structure underneath it first, because that 15 minutes of reading saves weeks of wasted infrastructure later. This isn't about predicting which chains are going to drop a token, or guessing how big that drop might be. I'm not going to tell you that, and nobody honestly can. What I can walk through is how to recognize which chains structurally can't airdrop, based on how they're actually built and funded, so you stop pouring farming hours into something that was never a candidate in the first place. A lot of the confusion in this space starts with testnets. Chains run them, sometimes incentivized, sometimes not. And farmers see activity happening and assume that activity automatically equals eligibility for something down the line. Sometimes it does. A lot of the time it doesn't. A testnet can exist purely to stress test infrastructure ahead of a mainnet launch that has nothing to do with rewarding retail users at all. Points, badges, leaderboards, all of that is marketing mechanics. It only turns into a token if the chain was actually planning a token distribution to begin with. Treat every points program as unconfirmed until you've gone and checked the token status sitting underneath it. Say you're 3 weeks into a testnet program right now, racking up points for bridging, swapping, and providing liquidity. And the leaderboard shows your wallet sitting in the top few thousand. That feels like progress. But if you go check the docs and the only mention of those points is a phrase like recognizing top contributors, with nothing about a future token, an allocation, or a snapshot, you're farming a leaderboard, not a token distribution. The points are real, the ranking is real, but neither of those things means there's a token sitting behind them, waiting to be claimed. There are a handful of concrete setups that make an airdrop structurally unlikely, and every single one of them is checkable before you commit a single wallet, let alone build out a whole farm around it. These aren't guesses about what a team is thinking. They're patterns you can verify from public documents in under half an hour. Isam boni, dapat pulustedean, isam bontas von implementiste. If a chain launched with a token sale, an ICO, or a pre-mine that already covers the team, the investors, and the ecosystem fund, there's often nothing left unallocated to airdrop to anyone. Some chains do carve out a retroactive allocation after the fact, sure, but that's the exception, not the default case. If you pull up the tokenomics page and 100% of the supply is already assigned to named buckets, there is nothing sitting in reserve for the wallets you'd be spending weeks farming. The second one is a chain that's VC funded with no public round at all. Chains that raise entirely from institutional money, with no public sale and no stated community allocation anywhere in their docs, generally don't need retail distribution to bootstrap usage. Their actual users tend to be enterprise partners or other protocols integrating at the infrastructure level, not individual wallets clicking through a bridge interface. Go check the funding announcement. If it names a handful of funds and says absolutely nothing about a public or community allocation, that's a signal worth weighing seriously before you commit anything. The third setup is an enterprise or permission chain. Some of these are built for a specific consortium, a supply chain use case, or a private financial network. And they're technically a blockchain, sure, but they were never designed to acquire a broad retail user base in the first place, which means there's no real reason for them to reward one. If the documentation is talking about authorized validators or permissioned participants instead of open participation, that's your answer right there, and you don't need to farm a single wallet on it to find that out the hard way. The fourth one is the simplest, and it's when the foundation has just said so, in some form. Not every team makes a clean statement about this, but some of them do. Things like there are no plans for a token, or the network fee token exists solely for gas and there's no additional distribution plan beyond that. Language like that can change later. Teams do change their minds, but it's still the most direct signal you're going to get, and it costs you nothing but a few minutes to go read it. Put those four together on a single project, and the pattern gets pretty easy to spot early. Say a chain raised its funding entirely from 3 institutional funds. No public round anywhere in the announcement. The tokenomics page lists a native token that's already 100% allocated to team, investors, and treasury. And the docs describe validators as authorized participants rather than an open set. That's 3 of the 4 signals stacking up in the same place, on the same chain, before you've bridged a single wallet over to test it. That's not proof of anything by itself, but it's a pretty strong reason to deprioritize that chain against one where none of those signals show up. None of this requires any insider information or a contact inside the team, and it's not about reading tea leaves either. It just requires reading what's already sitting there in public, which most farmers never actually do before they start clicking through a bridge and burning proxy sessions. Start with the tokenomics or treasury page if the chain has published one. A chain that actually intends to airdrop usually leaves an ecosystem or community allocation visible on the chart, often somewhere in the 5 to 20% range depending on the project. And that allocation is reserved and unvested, just sitting there waiting. If that bucket doesn't exist anywhere in the breakdown, there's nothing structurally there to distribute to you later, no matter how much volume you push through the chain. Then go check the funding history. A seed round from a single enterprise fund with no subsequent public sale suggests a very different growth strategy than a chain that ran an actual public token sale, or one that's explicitly building for a retail user base from day one. Neither of those guarantees an outcome either way, but they point in noticeably different directions. And that direction is useful information before you sink a farming season into it. Then look at how the team actually communicates, across blog posts, docs, and any AMA transcripts you can find. Teams that are planning to reward early users tend to describe activity in terms like future eligibility or contribution tracking, even if they're being vague about the specifics. Teams with no such plans usually describe that exact same activity in terms of network health, uptime, or developer adoption, with no mention of user rewards anywhere in the conversation. And finally, check whether the team has shipped a chain before, and what actually happened with that one. Some teams have distributed tokens to their early users on a prior project, and they're running the same playbook again on the new one. Other teams have shipped multiple chains with no retail distribution at all, ever, on any of them. Past behavior from the same team is one of the more reliable signals you'll find in this whole process, though it's still not a guarantee of anything. Here's why all of this matters more than most farmers give it credit for. Running wallets properly costs real infrastructure. Separate proxies per wallet cluster, separate device fingerprints or cloud phones per cluster, separate funding sources timed apart from each other so they don't line up. I run that setup myself, and it exists for a reason, because chain analysis firms and airdrop teams cluster wallets by shared signals when they're deciding who gets excluded from a distribution. That clustering works by looking at things like funding coming from the same source address across supposedly separate wallets, transactions executed in tight, repeatable time windows that look automated rather than human identical interaction sequences repeated across the same set of contracts, and shared device or network fingerprints showing up where they shouldn't. For example, 4 wallets that all receive their initial funding from the same source address within an hour of each other, then run the exact same 5-step bridge and swap sequence within minutes of one another, are showing exactly the kind of pattern that clustering tools are built to catch. None of that is a secret. It's published methodology that analytics firms talk about openly. And it's exactly why farmers who take this seriously separate their wallets the way they do, at real cost every single month. But here's the thing. That entire defensive setup only matters on a chain that's actually a distribution candidate in the first place. If a chain has no token, no ecosystem allocation, and no history of retail rewards from the team behind it, Sybil clustering is completely irrelevant because there's nothing to be excluded from in the first place. Spending your proxy budget and your device capacity defending against detection on a chain that was never going to airdrop anything is capacity that just isn't available for a chain that actually might. This is the actual argument for treating farming as operations instead of a lottery ticket you bought once and hope pays off. An operator budgets limited resources, proxies, devices, time, attention against the whole portfolio of chains, and that budget only makes sense if it's allocated based on which chains are structurally plausible in the first place. Farming everything indiscriminately doesn't make you more thorough. It just makes you less efficient with a budget that was never unlimited to begin with. Before you run a single interaction on a new chain, it's worth checking 5 things. Whether a native token already exists and is already fully allocated. Whether the funding round was public or purely institutional money. Whether the team has said anything explicit at all about token plans. Whether the chain is retail-facing or permissioned. And whether the same team has a track record of retail distribution on a prior project. None of that takes very long, and every single piece of it is public information sitting in docs and funding announcements you can read tonight. None of this is certainty, and I want to be clear about that. Chains change plans all the time. A team that said nothing about a token can turn around and announce one 18 months later. A chain with no ecosystem allocation today can carve one out retroactively if governance decides to. Treat these signals as prioritization, not exclusion. The point isn't to write a chain off forever. It's to stop putting your first priority farming effort into a chain that shows every sign of never distributing anything, while your proxies, your devices, and your time go toward chains where the structure actually supports it. I farm these the boring, methodical way, and I write up what actually qualifies. The full guides and the tools I trust are at airdropfarming.org. Full written guides and tested tool picks live at airdropfarming.org. So subscribe if you want the next breakdown when it goes up.